Hello, and welcome to another one of my nagging thoughts. Before I get to this week's topic, which is First Peter chapter 3, verse 2, I would like to take a brief moment and ask you to please like, subscribe, share, and above all, please do comment. I very much enjoy hearing what your thoughts are, even if I radically disagree. I think it's very edifying for people to be able to hear each other and see what kind of argumentation is being presented. That being said, let me turn my attention to this week's topic, and I'm going to start with the verse that precedes it for context. This is First Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. In the same way, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Then, if some are disobedient to the word, they will be won over without a word when they see your pure and reverent conduct. That's verse 2, when they see your pure and reverent conduct. So there's two places that I want to take a closer look. In the Greek, one is when they see, and the other one is the reverent conduct. So let's start with the when they see, and I apologize, I'm probably going to butcher this again. This is the Greek. It's epoptou, which essentially just means eyewitness. There's only one other New Testament reference using this word, and it's in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. And here's what that says. It says, and maintain good conduct among the non-Christians, so that though they now malign you as wrongdoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God when he appears. So same author, same book. What does it say? When they will see the reverent, pure behavior. It's on the day of judgment. So we shouldn't be building our treasure here where thieves and moths destroy. But if you love God and you love your husband, even if he doesn't love you, you should still seek his spiritual welfare, which according to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 5, may include a very rocky bottom. Here's what that verse says. And this is being said by Paul in the power of Jesus. He says, hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. And verse 1 makes it clear that the context that we're talking about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 is sexual immorality, right on point with a disobedient husband that we're talking about in 1 Peter chapter 3. I'm going to digress here a moment, share my personal commentary before I get to an examination or a closer look at the Greek on the word reverent here. The show Intervention, which I believe you can still find episodes of online, documents how addicts don't see the pain that their disobedience causes their loved ones until they get sober. And that point never comes until they run out of resources and hit rock bottom, if it comes at all. Some of the cases actually ended in death. They had no rock bottom. Now, an intervention is an effort to try to force a rock bottom by coming together to speak the truth in love while simultaneously cutting off the helpmeet, that empowers or enables the addiction to flourish. I added those words to try to emphasize that codependents think they're helping, but if you're dealing with some form of addiction, you're helping the addiction and not the addict. Especially if you are living in fear and reverence of the addict instead of God. But I jump ahead of myself. Now, as hard as and unlikely as it is for a hardcore addict to get sober, lots of people say that narcissists are a different breed that simply cannot change. I'm no psychology expert, but I do disagree. From my experience with my 18-year marriage to somebody with behavior that fits the description of a covert narcissist, I see this personality disorder as the fruit of an affirmation addiction. Affirmation is most potent in sexual relationships, and with tools like Tinder and WhatsApp and the like, it's no wonder that sex addiction is such an epidemic, not only in the general population, but even within the church, even within the church leadership. But because a narcissist is functionally addicted to attention, affirmation, and affection, it's something that can be had from any relationship, whether it's at work, friends, church, online chatting, anywhere. Because it's virtually impossible to cut off all forms of narcissistic supply, it's even harder for them to find rock bottom than it is for, say, a heroin addict, who, by the way, statistically only has about a 1% chance of kicking that habit. So I wouldn't hold my breath for a narcissist or a sex addict to get healthy. But that being said, as much as the odds are against sobriety, it is still remotely possible. And I personally know people who have come back from heroin. But loyally standing next to any form of addiction, like an ostrich with your head in the ground, is not going to open anyone's eyes, especially your own. The best chance of a Christian wife winning over her spouse who is disobedient to the word with her conduct is not to seek to manipulate him with her codependent behavior, nor is it to seek validation for her martyrdom from him. The most reverent thing that a wife can do is to help a disobedient spouse hit rock bottom. One of the best ways to do that in the role of a spouse is through a separation or a divorce. But God hates divorce, right? Malachi 2:16 says so. Well, if you read the rest of that verse, it ends with this command: pay attention to your conscience and do not be unfaithful. Because this verse ends with a call to pay attention to your conscience and not be unfaithful, God is not in the victim blaming business when it comes to divorce. This passage assumes that divorce is the direct and natural result of being unfaithful, not unforgiving. God doesn't want infidelity among his people, which is a sin that brings forth death to marriage that divorce merely ratifies. God himself gave the northern kingdom her divorce in Jeremiah, and he physically divorced the southern kingdom separately. So even if God does hate divorce, and there is some grammar debate about that I have not fully investigated yet, his own actions testify that God hates unfaithfulness much more. I was going to reference Matthew 19:29 here that promises exponential reward to all who forsake any family relationship or property for the sake of God. But the inclusion of the word wife in this verse is not in our oldest manuscripts. All manuscripts contain known errors, and I am sorry to inform my King James friends, I should say my King James only friends, but there are also known errors in that translation as well. But for my hardcore English royalty Bible friends that idolize this translation, you should know that the King James Version does explicitly include a spouse in the list of relationships a believer will be rewarded for leaving for the sake of God. But since that is a textual variant, I will make my case that leaving a disobedient spouse is the God-honoring move by appealing to Ecclesiastes 8:11 and Proverbs 22:3. You can look those up in whatever your preferred translation is. But the first says that immediate consequences are necessary to stop encouraging the human heart from doing evil. And the second verse says that a wise person sees danger and hides. Well, the first verse is appealing to the spiritual edification of the disobedient. The second is appealing to the spiritual edification of the faithful. These precepts are also consistent with Matthew chapter 10, verses 19 through 23 that I hope that you will look up. This is commanding Christians on how to act under persecution. And there's essentially a 3-step outline here, which is number 1, do not worry. Number 2, endure. And number 3, because the danger is real, flee. All this to say that consequences are something that a disobedient person will see. That comes from being pure and reverent towards God, not a disobedient addict of any kind, shape, or form. Okay, I'm moving on to this word reverent. So to remind you of the context, this is 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 2. It says, when they see your pure and reverent conduct. So the word reverent here is not the word hieropes. I'm butchering that as well, but that is the Greek word for reverence, and it is comprised of comes from two other words here. Hieros, which means sacred or holy, and prepo, which means fitting and suitable. And you only find this word in Titus chapter 2, verse 3, and it's said of godly women. This word for reverent in 1 Peter chapter 3 is not that word. It's also not the word eulabehomai. Again, I'm butchering this stuff. I don't speak Greek. This word means to be piously cautious. And the connotation is to be well received or to receive well. It's coming again from some other words. It comes from the word eulabes, which means devout, and that's actually comprised of comes from two other Greek words. One, which is which means well, and lambano, which means to take hold of or receive. So this is not this idea. So it's not the idea of being sacred and holy, fitting to the circumstance or the role of wife. That was the hieropres, and it's also not this eulabome, which is to be piously cautious. And this is something that it was used to describe Noah's behavior in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, and also to describe Jesus's behavior in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, which really is, it's rendered there as devotion. This word in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 2 for reverent is actually the word phobos, which you can probably recognize the word phobia. It means panic, flight, fear, the causing of fear or terror. This is actually the same word that is rendered as reverent in verse 2. It's rendered as fear in verse 6. So the King James actually renders verse 6 as terror. But let me read, since I already read verse 2 to you in the New English Translation, let me read verse 6 for you as well. It says, like Sarah who obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, you become her children when you do what is good and have no fear in doing so. So what is rendered up here as reverent conduct in verse 2 is rendered as fear in verse 6. And I just find that quite interesting that it's the same word and it's not rendered consistently. But when I was meditating on this idea of fear and having no fear in doing what is good, which is in verse 6, I come to the same conclusion, and I'm going to back this up with scripture. But the disobedient do not find conviction in behavior that trembles before them to enable their self-destruction. Ecclesiastes 8:11 says that their hearts are encouraged to do evil by that. But they will be convicted by faithful behavior that's undefiled by sin, that trembles before God, at least on the judgment day. They might also be convicted by witnessing the fruit of the Spirit in this life, meaning that it is possible that your husband's eyes might be opened by your pure and reverent behavior towards God. Although it's not a guarantee. So if you have previously tried to reason with your disobedient spouse, which is in accordance with Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 17, if you've already done that and you know that you cannot berate or manipulate your spouse into following God with words or law keeping or living in fear of your spouse, but you can pick up your cross and follow God and set an example for your spouse as to how to walk away from self-destruction without vengeance or following their destructive example. This phobos is used in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. This is what it says there. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Instead, fear the one who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. This is coming from the same passage in Matthew chapter 10, verse 19 through 23 that I referenced previously. And this is going through that same outline. Do not worry, endure, and flee as to how to deal with persecution. So I want to point out that not being afraid does not mean that you do not flee. So you're not afraid of the person that can only kill your body but not your soul, but you still have respect for your own body. You get away from harm. I'm sorry, I have a dog here begging for attention while I'm trying to do this. It's very distracting. Now, first Peter 3 verse 6 seems to parallel this with the qualifier, do what is good and have no fear in doing so. If there's danger, flee without fear of approval for doing so. And this is what I think the whole context is really getting at. This is not I think primarily talking about physical danger. Although if you have been acting like an ostrich with your head in the sand, that may be where you're at right now in the risks that you're facing. And you need to take that very seriously and protect yourself and all living things that are subject to self-destruction, because it can be quite volatile, and so can things like infidelity. Side note, was listening to even somebody that I really respect talk on this topic of infidelity, saying that it's an isolated thing and you don't have to really fear for other things. But if somebody's able to defraud you and gratify themselves, especially long term, you have no idea what they're capable of. You have no idea what the people that they're involved with are capable of. But things can get very volatile very quickly. So if you perceive danger, definitely get out of there. But I think the fear that we're talking about here is this fear of rejection, this fear of not being affirmed and accepted. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of people becomes a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord will be set on high. The Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, renders the single Hebrew word here for trembling fear as phobeo, which means to put to flight with terror, and askunomai. I am so bad with Greek, I apologize. But in any case, that second word that's in the Septuagint, that's not in the original Hebrew, is to make ashamed. So in the Greek version of the Old Testament, this verse, Proverbs 29:25, it's saying that this being put to flight with terror because of shame from people is what becomes a snare. So that is really what I think we're primarily talking about here when we're talking about fear, is who are you trying to please, not like fear of your life. All this to say, the reverent conduct that should be witnessed by a disobedient spouse here in 1 Peter chapter 3 is one that is not trying to please a disobedient husband, but rather God. In closing, I want to remind everyone that the first commandment is to not have any gods before the Lord God. So as a community of believers, I beg you to stop preaching to faithful women to functionally worship their husbands. It is destroying men as it encourages their hearts to do evil, and it is causing the women of God to get their value from an idol of marriage, something that is so temporary that Jesus said it doesn't even exist in heaven. And you can see that in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. I thank you guys very, very much for your time. I hope that this is helpful to you and that it does help those of you that are in difficult marriages get healthier. And I also pray that it helps the people that are giving people in destructive marriages better advice. So more God-honoring, godly advice. So with that said, I hope to see you next week. And again, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. God bless.